Okay. A brief look at Either Or by Søren Kierkegaard. The main ideas of which are: the aesthetical mode of existence is exemplified by both romantic hedonism and abstract intellectualism. Both the sensualist and the intellectual fail to commit themselves decisively and thereby to achieve existence and selfhood. Only through choice is authentic selfhood attained. Life is a matter of either or. The aesthetical way leads to boredom, melancholy, and despair. In turning toward decision and commitment because of despair, the self passes from the aesthetical stage to the ethical. In the ethical stage, in virtue of having chosen itself, the self becomes centralized, unified, and authentic. The third stage of development is the religious, but no stage is sufficient by itself. The ethical stage transfigures the aesthetical, and the religious transfigures the ethical. Either Or is a 2-volume work in which the author seeks to elucidate the contrast and interrelationships between the aesthetical and the ethical modes of existence. As with most of the writings of Kierkegaard, Either Or was not published under his own name. The elucidations are penned under various pseudonyms. The first volume contains an analysis and description of the territory of the aesthetical. The literary style is heterogeneous. Use is made of lyrical aphorisms, orations, psychological analyses, drama, reviews, philosophical formulations. The aestheticist, expressing his views through these various literary forms, is designated as A, capital A. The ethical thinker, in volume 2, bearing the pseudonym of Judge William, is designated as B. In one of his later works, concluding Unscientific Postscript, Kierkegaard has explained the central theme of Either Or by informing the reader that A is an existential possibility, superior in dialectics and highly gifted in the uses of wit and poetic style, who nevertheless remains unable to commit himself in decisive action, and thus never exists in the true sense at all. B, on the other hand, represents the ethical man whose whole life is transformed into inwardness, passion, and commitment. Judge William elucidates the content of the ethical in the form of a letter addressed to A. The communication of ethical truth demands a form or style which is commensurate with it. Ethical truth is existential and concrete as contrasted with the theoretical and abstract, and consequently requires for its expression a form which has the personal quality of a dialogue or a letter. This constitutes the form of indirect communication. At the outset, Judge William reminds the aestheticist of the biblical story of the prophet Nathan and David as a supreme example of this form of communication. King David listened attentively to the prophet's parable, but remained in a state of theoretical detachment. He intellectualized the parable as an objective story which applied only to the mythical stranger. Not until the prophet Nathan made the application explicit in his statement, "Thou, O king, art the man," did David apprehend the existential relevance of the parable. The prophet Nathan used the form of indirect communication. This is also the form used by Judge William. The aesthetical mode of existence has two primary expressions: romantic hedonism and abstract intellectualism. Mozart's Don Giovanni is depicted as the classical representative of the sensual or hedonistic view of life, and Goethe's Faust expresses the aesthetical personality of abstract intellectualism. Kierkegaard's arch-enemy, the Hegelian rationalist, also falls victim to the latter expression. For both the sensualist and the intellectualist, inward existence and commitment are accidental and remain a matter of indifference. Neither is able to shoulder his responsibility and commit himself to inaction. They lack the ethical pathos which characterizes B. The view of life which characterizes the hedonist is portrayed by the young lover in the Diary of a Seducer, who carries through his seduction with a diabolical cunning. The young lover is a prototype of Mozart's Don Giovanni. He experiments with numerous possibilities, but nevertheless commits himself to the responsibility of actualizing any particular one. He never commits himself to the possibility of actualizing any particular one in earnestness and seriousness. He experiments with the techniques of seduction, but never commits himself to a promise. He experiments with love, but never commits himself in marriage. In his aesthetical experimentation, the young lover retains the proper abstractness and indifference about him. Every girl is for him a woman in general. Insofar as the young lover has a guiding principle, it is the hedonistic principle that enjoyment or pleasure constitutes the only end of life. The necessary internal conditions for the attainment of this life of pleasure are physical beauty and health. The necessary external conditions are wealth, glory, and high status. But these conditions provide no ethical pathos for a committed life. And it is precisely committed life which the young lover seeks to avoid. He lives only in the moment, utilized as an erotic present in which the satisfaction of a desire is maximized, but then the moment passes and a new desire asserts its claim to thrive. His whole life becomes a discontinuous succession of passing from one moment to the next. His personality thus lacks unity and continuity. He has dispersed or lost himself in the present to the neglect of his past and his future. He no longer retains his past in memory, and he retreats from his future, which confronts him with the responsibility of decision. The speculative intellectualist suffers from the same loss of selfhood as the romantic hedonist, whereas the hedonist loses himself in the immediacy of his thought, whereas the hedonist loses himself in the immediacy of the erotic present, the speculative thinker loses himself in the immediacy of his thought. The speculative thinker seeks to comprehend the whole of reality through the categories of a universal logic. But in such a system, the concretely existing subject does not matter. Just as for the sensualist every girl is a woman in general, so for the intellectualist all reality is dissolved into general categories. Speculative thought sees only the general movement of history, explained through the mediation of logical categories, but forgets the individual who apprehends himself within his particular and concrete history. Thus, both the hedonist and the speculative thinker evade the responsibility of decision. Both flirt with the realm of possibility, but neither makes the leap into existence. The hedonist escapes from the future and responsibility by dispersing himself in momentary pleasures. The speculative thinker evades choice by playing the role of a detached observer who speculates about the general movements in world history, but who never participates in his own inner history with pathos and inwardness. Expressing the Socratic irony of which Kierkegaard was a master, his pseudonym is made to say, and I quote, "To the philosopher and world history is concluded," and he mediates. Hence, in our age, as the order of the day, we have the disgusting sight of young men who are able to mediate Christianity and paganism, are able to play with titanic forces of history, and are unable to tell a plain man what he has to do in life, and who do not know any better what they themselves have to do. End quote. The speculative thinker reduces existence to thought, sacrifices involvement for detached observation, and substitutes a reflective deliberation on universal history for the responsibility of concrete personal decision. The common denominator of both expressions of aesthetical existence is a retreat from the reality of choice. In both cases, the self has not yet found itself. Only through choice is authentic selfhood attained. This demands an awareness that life is a matter of either-or, but the either-or is a matter of indifference for the hedonist and the intellectualist alike. The aestheticist moves in a realm in abstraction from inwardness and existence. The aesthetical mode or stage of existence leads to boredom and melancholy, and finally to despair. Either or, and the writings of Kierkegaard as a whole contain graphic descriptions of the enveloping character of the moods of boredom, melancholy, and despair. Boredom is depicted as an aesthetical determinant which has plagued man from the very beginning. I quote, "The gods were bored, and so they created man. Adam was bored because he was alone, and so Eve was created. Thus boredom entered the world and increased in proportion to the increase of population. Adam was bored alone, then Adam and Eve were bored together. Then Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel were bored en famille. Then the population of the world increased and the people were bored en masse." End quote. The aesthetical life of pure pleasure as well as that of pure thought leads to an abyss of boredom and tedium. Now it is necessary to distinguish two forms of boredom. In one form, boredom is apprehended as an intentional mood which is directed toward a particular object, event, or person. One is bored with a book, a movie, or a boorish conversant. This form of boredom is merely a surface phenomenon which does not yet disclose man's true situation. In the second and more genuine form of boredom, one is bored not with an intentionally specified object or person, one is bored with oneself. Man is confronted with a nameless emptiness which threatens life itself with a loss of meaning. This form of boredom brings man to a more intensified awareness of his predicament. The enigmatic, nameless emptiness which characterizes genuine boredom is also an existential determinant of this melancholy individual. If the melancholy individual is asked what it is that weighs upon him, he is prone to reply, "I know not, I cannot explain it." Melancholy is a spiritual ailment, or an hysteria of the spirit, which confronts man in the abyss of emptiness and meaninglessness, and reveals the disquietude and discontinuity of his existence. But for the most part, the individual who is subject to the disquieting moods of boredom and melancholy refuses to accept his condition and seeks to conceal it through various diverting activities. Like Blaise Pascal, Kierkegaard saw profoundly how man seeks to escape from himself through diversions which provide momentary distraction. The continuing search for diversion is descriptively characterized in the concept of the rotation method, elucidated in Volume 1. Man is bored with life in the country, so he moves to the village. He becomes bored in the village, so he moves to the city. He then becomes bored with his homeland and travels abroad. He becomes bored with life in a foreign land, and then entertains the possibility of an endless journeying to alleviate his boredom. So also the melancholy individual engages in a self-defeating and frustrating search for diversion. It is in Nero, says the author, that we find the example par excellence of a melancholy nature that had given itself over to the endless search for diverting distractions. Nero sought to divert himself through an immersion into pleasure. He appointed ministers of pleasure who were entrusted with the task of finding novel ways to satisfy his desires. Only in the moment of pleasure could Nero find distraction from his melancholy. Then he grasped after pleasure. All the world's cleverness must devise for him new pleasures, for only in the instant of pleasure does he find repose, and when that is past he gasps with faintness. When this instant of pleasure passes, Nero again plunges into melancholy. Hence a new desire must be created so that another momentary gratification may occur. But there is no end to this sort of thing, and Nero finds himself sucked into an abyss of meaninglessness and emptiness. Finally, in his need for pleasure-producing distraction, he orders the burning of Rome, but when the last embers die, he again gyrates into an appalling melancholy. This description of Nero's nature, we are reminded by the author, has not been undertaken as an occasion to thank God along with the Pharisee, that we are different from Nero. Nero is flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone, which is to say that in Nero a universal determinant of human existence becomes transparent. Despair is the most intensive expression of the threat of meaninglessness and emptiness. It constitutes the culmination of the ascetical mode of existence. The ascetical life proves itself to be despair. In despair, the self experiences a loss of hope because diversion no longer provides its momentary satisfaction. The aestheticist now realizes that he cannot find himself outside of himself, neither in his hedonistic or sensual pursuits, nor in the abstractions of his speculative thought. To discover his genuine selfhood, he must turn inward. He must turn towards earnestness, passion, decision, commitment, and freedom. Only in this movement will he be able to collect himself out of his dispersed and dissipated existence and become a unified and integrated self. Despair is thus an intensification of subjectivity which constitutes the gateway to authentic or genuine selfhood. In choosing despair, the self gives birth to itself and passes from the ascetical stage of indecision to the ethical stage of decisive commitment. The ethical stage is the stage of decision and resolute commitment. The active choice is an intensification of the ethical. Even the richest personality, writes the author, must be accounted as nothing before he has chosen himself. On the other hand, the poorest personality is everything for having chosen himself. Choice liberates the self, both from the immediacy of pleasure and from the immediacy of reflection or pure thought, and makes possible the discovery of genuine selfhood. Through decision and commitment, the self becomes integrated and centralized. The aestheticist, I need to rewrite this, it's not good for a man with a lisp. The aestheticist is always eccentric, in that he seeks to the center of his self in the periphery of hedonist and intellectualist concerns, which means that he has lost his self. The ethical man, by virtue of having shouldered his responsibility in decision, has his center within himself. His life is centralized and unified. The unity of the ethical self is not a unity which is anchored in some residual ego or abiding substratum. The self is not an object which can be abstractly defined as having a permanent nature or substantial fixity. Unity is achieved, not given. The self achieves or attains its unity and integrity through choice. Choice thus becomes the central category for the ethical thinker. This is the category which lies closest to the heart and thought of Judge William. Not being a logician, he has no lengthy and impressive list of abstract categories. He has only one concrete denomination, choice. Now choice involves freedom and either or, and it is in this that we find the greatest treasure which man can possess. Judge William explains to the reader the central intention of his ethical elucidations when he writes, and I quote, "For freedom, therefore, I am fighting for the future, for either or, that is the treasure I desire to bequeath to those whom I love in the world, yea, in my little son. If my little son were at this instant of an age when he could thoroughly understand me, I would say to him, I leave to thee no fortune, no title, no dignities, but I know where there lies buried a treasure which suffices to make thee richer than the whole world, and this treasure belongs to thee, and thou shalt not even express thanks to me for it, lest thou take hurt to thine own soul by owing everything to another. This treasure is deposited in thine own inner self. There is an either or which makes a man greater than the angels." End quote. Judge William's central intention of calling the asceticist to an awareness of his freedom and the importance of choosing is understood as an expression of the Socratic task of attaining self-knowledge. Know thyself and choose thyself are conjunctive rather than disjunctive tasks. The knowledge which was the concern of Socrates was the ethical knowledge, and ethical knowledge can be achieved only through choosing. The self becomes transparent to itself only in decisive action. In the person of Judge William, we find the concrete exemplification of the ethical mode of existence. He is a married man who has committed himself in conjugal love. As such, he is contrasted with the young lover of the Diary of a Seducer who dissipates himself in his various experiments with romantic love. Romantic and conjugal love are thus understood as existential qualities which differentiate the aesthetical and the ethical. Romantic love is experimental and non-historical, lacking continuity. Conjugal love expresses an inner history which gives it constancy and stability. The romantic hedonist lives in the present, and this present he experiences is in abstraction from existence. The present becomes an instantaneous now, defined as the occasion for enjoyment. The past loses its existential significance, and the future is never really faced. The young lover seduces the girl, and after the moment of seduction passes, all is over. The moment then becomes part of an abstracted past, which has significance only as an object for melancholy recollection. Romantic love knows no repetition. The romantic hedonist lives his life as though it were a discrete succession of instantaneous nows, each now coming to be and passing away into a past which is bereft of existential importance. Everything is concentrated in the present, which is apprehended as embodying full reality. Conjugal love, on the other hand, strives for repetition. The ideal husband is one who is able to repeat his love every day. The man carries within himself the memory of his past, anticipates his future, and undertakes his daily tasks and decisions in the context of his integrated wholeness. His past, future, and present are unified. It is thus that time and history become of paramount importance for conjugal love. The constancy and continuity of conjugal love are made possible through a unification of the self in its inner history. In distinguishing between romantic and conjugal love, Judge William does not intend an absolute disjunction. He speaks of marriage as the true transfiguration of romantic love. Marriage is a friend, not its enemy. Romantic love is not left behind in the transition to the ethical sphere. It becomes transfigured through the constancy of conjugal love. In the ethical stage, romantic love is historicized and apprehended in terms of its temporal significance. The aesthetical always remains in the ethical, but it remains as the relative and dependent mode of existence. I quote, "By the absolute choice, the ethical is always posited, and from this it does not follow by any means that the aesthetical is excluded. In the ethical, the personality is concentrated in itself, so the aesthetical is absolutely excluded, or is excluded as the absolute, but relatively it is still left." End quote. The romantic hedonist absolutizes the aesthetical as the final and self-sufficient dimension of existence. The ethical man appropriates the aesthetical in its relativity and transforms it by the existential determinants of choice and commitment. At one point in his letter, Judge William speaks of the three stages, aesthetical, ethical, and religious, as three great allies. The spheres or stages of existence are not temporally successive levels of development, excluding each other in a hierarchical ascent. They are modes of existence always in some sense present, penetrating the personality in its process of becoming. They constitute the existential cross-section of the self and coexist interdependently throughout its history. No sphere is sufficient by itself. The absolutization of one of the three spheres brings about a suffocation of the self. The phenomenon of time, which plays such an important role in ethical existence, is the focus of a profound analysis of Hegel's teaching on the alienated or unhappy consciousness. Hegel had already taught that the alienated consciousness is the self that is never present to itself, being absent from itself either in the past or in the future. The author agrees that Hegel was right in thus defining the realm of the unhappy consciousness, but argues that he was wrong in understanding it abstractly rather than existentially. Hegel, and I quote, "beheld the kingdom from afar off." End quote. The author understands himself to be a native inhabitant of this realm. Consciousness is alienated from itself when it has severed either from its past or from its future. The alienated consciousness has lost the memory of its life and has nothing for which to hope. Thus it culminates in despair. The unified consciousness has within it both pastness and futurity. Memory and hope are unified in the center of personality. The ethical man attains this unified consciousness in the moment of decisive action. In the act of choice, the past is taken up, the future is acknowledged and faced, and the self is centralized. The touchstone of the decision through which the self achieves its unity and integrity is inwardness. An authentic choice is a choice made inwardly in passion and earnestness. The accent falls on the way of choosing rather than on what is chosen. In the ethical sphere, man is educated in how to choose. His first concern is not with the choice of the right, but with the earnestness and inwardness which determine the movement of choice. This does not mean that the ethical thinker has no interest in the moral content of choice. It does mean, however, that the moral content cannot be abstracted as a what, as an objectively determined and legislated moral standard. An action made solely because of external standards is bereft of moral content. Only the action which proceeds from the depths of inwardness qualifies the self as ethical. Judge William has little interest in a table of virtues which delineates abstract moral requirements. Ethical action is not a matter of following virtues, it is a matter of self-knowledge and self-commitment. Like Nietzsche's strong man, Kierkegaard's ethical man exists beyond good and evil. Either or concludes with a prayer and a sermon. This is a reminder to the reader that the ethical stage is not the final dimension of existence, but is itself transfigured by a religious state. As the ethical stage transfigures the aesthetical by introducing the existential determinants of suffering, guilt, sin, and faith. I'll say that again. As the ethical stage transfigures the aesthetical, so the religious transfigures the ethical by introducing the existential determinants of suffering, guilt, and faith. But either or does not carry the existential elucidation beyond the ethical. One of the reasons why Kierkegaard wrote his book, Stages on Life's Way, which appeared 2 years after Either or, was to give proper due to the religious stage.